Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the VSC podcast. My name's Olivia, and I'm the Community Prevention Manager at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, where we provide free therapy, support, and advocacy for victims of sexual assault, violent crimes, and traumatic circumstances. Today we're diving into the roles of different professionals who support survivors, focusing on the importance of advocacy and medical care. Join me first with Nicola Pritchard, our lead victim advocate, who plays an essential role in providing direct support and resources to our survivors. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you first to share a little bit maybe about yourself and what you do with your work for the VSC.
Sure. So I am Nicola, obviously. I am the lead victim advocate at the Victim Service Center. I've been with the Victim Service Center for about 3 years. I was actually originally from Cape Town, South Africa, which played a big role in me kind of getting into victim advocacy work. The rates of crime are very high there, and especially the rates of sexual violence. So it's always something that was near to me and an important issue for me. My whole family still lives there. So from the experiences that I had growing up and kind of how it shaped my worldview when I moved to the States, that still was very important to me, and doing that work here on a different level. And I eventually went on to do my master's in social work. I did some work with the Child Advocacy Center in Osceola, which was an amazing experience, and then eventually ended up at Victim Service Center.
Awesome.
So now I do this.
Yeah, so that's very interesting that you kind of witnessed some of the things happening in your community and where you grew up, and that it shaped your worldview and kind of propelled you into this career and working as a victim advocate and a crisis counselor.
Yeah.
So tell me more about what a victim advocate does for our viewers at home who might not be aware.
So I think the way that I like to best describe it, and the way that I actually explain it to survivors who come to us, is that I'm here to serve the survivor. I don't work for law enforcement. I don't work for the state attorney's office. I work for the survivor. And so really our role is to help make a very uncomfortable situation as comfortable as we can. And so to decrease some of the very big negative feelings that they may have, we want to get rid of anything that's unnecessarily harmful to them and provide a sense of support, especially for people who maybe don't have that support system. We have the opportunity to be a constant for them in their life, where maybe they don't have the family support, maybe they don't have the support of their friends. They know they can turn to us, come to Victim Service Center, and get that support. So we do that primarily through emotional support, being there for them, whether it's at the acute collection, if we are doing sessions with them, just providing that space for them to process and to show up authentically, where they don't have to filter out things the way that you do for family and friends. You can have any reaction, and you know that that's a non-judgmental space where you're not going to be looked at differently for having a reaction that maybe people think is wrong, or a bad reaction. People can react however they need to in that space and be accepted and validated.
Awesome. So it sounds like you provide maybe immediate support to survivors on site or through that exam and forensic collection, as well as supporting them throughout their recovery or through their journey of healing, keeping a safe space in mind and trying to allow them to have that opportunity to just get out what they need to and have a supportive environment that's maybe trauma-informed.
And we try to, as much as we can, have a continuity of care. So one of the things that I really like about the work that we do at Victim Service Center is that we are the ones who answer the helpline. So if someone's requesting a forensic collection, let's say they speak to me, I meet them at the site, I go through the collection with them. If they are looking for counseling services, I do the counseling with them. If they have a court case, I go with them to the court. I provide that emotional support to them. So it's the same person, for the most part, going through the entire process with them. So you're able to build really good rapport and kind of keep, again, a constant for them in a situation that feels very unpredictable. And that's just kind of the nature of trauma, is that it's unpredictable. So it keeps it more constant and gives almost a sense of control to them as well.
So you're trying to be that that dedicated support for them, whether it's going to court, whether it's showing up at one of our confidential care sites, or just providing those counseling services with them, being that individual that they can lean on and providing a consistent individual and a reliable one to give them this sense of that they have someone they can trust and rely on. What would you say to survivors who maybe have experienced some type of trauma and they're considering reaching out for support and help, but they're just not sure how to take that next step?
Yeah, I think knowing that we are here to provide support in the way that you need. So I know for a lot of people, sometimes the barrier is they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to come in and have to tell the story again. We're never going to ask you to tell the story again. I always like to tell people, I don't even have to know what happened to you to help you and the ways that it has affected you. Because the trauma isn't really just the thing that happened, it's how it affects your worldview, it's how it affects your relationships, your relationship with yourself. And we can work on all those things without you having to tell me the trauma narrative, which can be re-traumatizing for people to have to revisit that place. So I always like to give people that heads up of, we will talk about as much as or as little as you would like.
Keeping the power still in their possession.
Very much in their control. And if someone is considering reaching out, just knowing that you can stop services at any time, you can provide feedback. If, let's say, your advocate asks you about something and you're not ready, that is totally okay. You don't have to tell us anything. You get to dictate the way that that progresses and the way that services progress.
That's really encouraging for survivors, that they get to be kind of in control, in the driver's seat of their own healing journey. So if someone's a little hesitant to reach out because they don't want to reshare their story, or they're worried about some levels of re-traumatization happening, that we are mindful of that and working hard to ensure that we do what they're comfortable with. So when survivors are kind of looking forward to this holiday season, we know that it can be a little more difficult for survivors during this time. Maybe they don't have as much friends and family to rely on, or they're maybe not empathetic with their situation. What is some advice you could give to survivors who are nervous looking forward to the holiday season, and how can they support themselves and take care of themselves during this time?
I think one of the biggest things that I go through with survivors that I work with is safety planning. And sometimes safety planning always sounds like this very intense, big, scary thing that we do, but sometimes it can just be emotional safety planning. So if you know that you're going to a family member's house, coming up with plans of, these are my biggest triggers in that space. These are the biggest things that are going to resurface some trauma for me, or I know this is going to be hard to process emotionally in that space. Coming up with a plan in advance, because we know that the way that trauma affects the brain, it's really hard to think on the spot because that logic center of your brain gets shut down. So I always like to come up with a couple scenarios for people, and then how would you navigate that space? I think it's also helpful if you have people in your life who are your support system. It doesn't have to be family, it can be friends. Coming up with a plan that potentially involves them. So maybe you bring someone with you to an event, and if they hear something, for some people the response is shutting down. So if they see that shutdown, what can they do in that space to help you through it? And then I always like to have a discussion on boundaries and really be clear with yourself on what you feel comfortable with, and putting that control, again, back in their hands of, you can set boundaries with people in your life and people that maybe you don't want to see, you don't want to interact with. That's okay, and it doesn't make you a bad person. I think that's what people worry about the most.
Right, that guilt level of not interacting with family or friends the way they expect them to, or if they're not aware or mindful of the things that trigger them or spaces that might make them, not feel comfortable. So it sounds like safety planning is a big part of preparing for the holiday season, and giving them that opportunity to think through situations that might arise that could be hard to think through in the time being, and giving them, avenues of either support or resources or, what to do if.
Yeah,
right?
And I think too, something that I wish was talked about more with the holidays and trauma is the grief that sometimes is a part of it. So for people who maybe don't have that support from their family, that's an area of grief for them, or people who maybe don't talk to their family anymore because of the trauma and are having a holiday without their family or without a support system. There's grief in that as well.
Absolutely.
So I think making a plan to be kind to yourself during those times when maybe you are grieving or things are coming up for you, I think that's super important as well.
Yeah, remember right off the bat to be kind to yourself. Well, thank you so much, Nicola, for coming here today and sharing about your expertise and helping survivors.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Next, we'll be joined by Chris Bemis, a sexual assault nurse examiner, to discuss the unique role of SANES in supporting survivors. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the VSC podcast. I'm now joined by Chris Bemis, one of our dedicated sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANES, here at the Victim Service Center. Chris, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Would you mind explaining for our viewers at home what a SANE is, for those who might not be aware?
Well, SANE stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, and a SANE is a nurse. We're required to be either a registered nurse or advanced practice nurse.
Gotcha.
And we care for patients that are experiencing sexual assault.
Okay, so the SANES are nurses who are specifically in place to respond to survivors of sexual assault. What kind of specific training do SANES go through to kind of get that title?
Okay. Well, like I said before, we have to be registered nurses at least. And we should have about 2 years experience in a field that has more experience with advanced assessment skills.
Okay.
Some examples would be an emergency room nurse, a critical care nurse, and also a nurse that might work with OBGYN with mother-baby type care.
And why are nurses the choice for this role to receive this training and to provide this service to sexual assault survivors?
Well, we make a good choice because with our advanced skills and assessment, even in our basic training, we do assessment training, but we also have training in obtaining specimens. So we can integrate both of those things together when we're collecting for our forensic evidence.
Right.
So we naturally fit that role very comfortably, and it also allows us to not put our patients through more trauma with doing those two things separately.
Right, right. And so you work very closely with victim advocates in your response to sexual assault survivors. Can you talk a little bit about that collaboration and what that looks like?
Yes, that's very important because we want to allow that patient to be able to make their own decisions. Consent is very important in our field. We can, as nurses, provide pros and cons, benefits, and answer any questions on anything that they may be struggling with and making decisions about in different parts of that exam. They have that choice to proceed or even not take part in different aspects of the exam. So our advocates are there also to help them through that process, while the nurses are also trained to be supportive and give that patient room to make those decisions. The advocate can be right there to support them through those decisions too.
Right. Decision making in a time like that, and maybe after something traumatic happening, might not be easy for the survivor. So having that victim advocate there, and as well as, it sounds like a trauma-informed nurse as well, to ensure the space is comfortable, that they feel empowered to make their own decisions there, and that we're all mindful of consent in the response to survivors, right? So how do you ensure that you are weaving in that trauma-informed care element to your response to survivors? When you're treating them, how do you ensure that they feel comfortable and supported?
Well, we're always looking at them first as nurses. That's the most important thing. So we want to make sure that we're watching their body language. We're making sure that they feel comfortable, asking if there are any needs that they have. Are they hungry? Are they needing more rest? Are they needing to use the restroom before we start for care? We want to make sure that we're doing it at their pace.
Yeah.
Giving them breaks when needed, and also allowing them to make decisions to not proceed with things. We always want to make sure that they're their decisions, not ours.
Yeah, that's great. And what would you say to survivors who maybe are on the fence about engaging with SANES or getting that forensic exam collection after an assault, to maybe either support their decision one way or the other?
Well, just like I said, we're there for them. That's always how I start my introduction, is that we're so glad that you are here. We know how hard it is for them to get to that point.
Right.
So we want to let them know that we're supportive of them, and that the whole time that they are there, they'll be the ones that will be making the decisions, and we can give them, provide them with options, and help them to be better able to understand what they're going through and what their choices are. But in the end, they'll be the ones that'll be allowed to make those decisions, even if it is to not go forward.
Right. And they have the option, even if they get the forensic exam, to not report, right? It doesn't
Correct.
have to go hand in hand with one another.
That is correct. And they also have 120 hours, which is about 5 days,
Okay.
To actually do the exam.
Right. And what's the best advice to give to survivors who in that window are considering it? I know maybe they need to try to hang on to clothing, or maybe not smoke or eat or drink, right? What would you say to survivors in that time period so that they can still come in to get that collection if they decide to do so?
Right. It is important for them to know that the forensic collection is best if they do not change their clothes, do not shower, drink, eat, smoke, do anything to their body that would potentially take some of that forensic evidence away.
Right.
But also, when we do have patients that come in that, for example, have showered, we want to let them know that that's okay. That at that time they did what they needed to do to
Right.
care for themselves, and it does not mean that there's still not the potential to have evidence found.
Right, so it's not too late. Even if they've showered or eaten or done
Correct.
something, they can still come in for that exam, and it's most important that they take care of themselves first and foremost.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for being here today and for sharing a little bit more about what SANES are and what they do, and letting our viewers know as well that this service is available. After the break, we're going to be rejoined by Nicola Pritchard, our lead victim advocate, to debunk some of the common misconceptions about sexual violence and supporting survivors, so stay tuned. Welcome back to our viewers and to Nicola, our lead victim advocate at the Victim Service Center. On this segment, we're going to go through some of the common misconceptions and myths that exist about sexual violence and work to debunk some of these. Nicola, thank you again for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So as a victim advocate, have you noticed that there are a prevalence of misconceptions or myths surrounding sexual violence that makes it more difficult for survivors to work through their healing journey?
So many.
Right.
It's one of those things where when you think that you're making progress on the stigma of one myth, you're like, here's 5 more that people have just invented. So there are so many, and it's interesting to see the new myths that are popping up as technology evolves and as different forms of sexual assault and sexual violence kind of evolve.
Right.
So yes, they are ever present, unfortunately.
Right. So let's go through some of the most common ones and work to debunk those for our viewers. I've got a couple here with me. Our first one, myth 1, sexual violence is mostly committed by strangers. What is the truth of that?
So I think, as far as I know, the most updated statistic is 8 out of 10 sexual assaults are committed by somebody who that person knows is in that support system. I think it might be 9 out of 10 for child sexual abuse.
So it's not just a stranger, in a trench coat following us, right? Sometimes it's our neighbors or our friends or sometimes our partners. I know also a lot of times people think that it can't happen within a relationship or within, two consenting partners, but it definitely can, right? We see that happen all the time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the long-standing perception of what sexual assault is that image of a dark alleyway, and specifically a woman walks down that alleyway alone and there's a man in the bush and jumps out, and that's the situation. And it's not that that doesn't happen,
right,
but that is far more infrequent than sexual assaults that, one, don't seem that violent physically, and also it's by someone that you know and that you trust. And I think that is partially to do with the nature of sexual violence and the most common forms of sexual violence, where maybe there's that verbal coercion aspect, and it's hard to do that with somebody that you don't know and you don't have that trust with. And so a lot of the time, the power that comes with the act of sexual violence comes from the concern about how this impacts the survivor's life if they don't do this thing. And so when you have emotional investment with somebody, that risk is so much higher of the loss if you tell someone about it, if you behave in a certain way, if you fight back. And so we find that perpetrators of sexual violence take advantage of that aspect a lot more. Not to say that stranger assaults don't happen.
Right.
Absolutely they do, but it's much more frequent for it to be somebody in that person's support system.
Right. It's so important that we're aware of the reality of what sexual violence looks like for survivors so that we don't discredit what's happened to them because it just doesn't look like what our perception of that violence is, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the second myth that I have here is people assume if a survivor didn't fight back, didn't run away immediately, that they must have consented to what's going on. So what's really the reality of that?
Our brains, oh my gosh, I'm going to give such a horribly nerdy answer to this.
Please do.
But our brains are so complex, and I think that there has been this belief that trauma is not a physical reaction. It's just an emotional experience. And it's just not true. And I think that that also adds to the stigma of not fighting back or maybe having a different reaction to something traumatic, especially something as personal as a sexual assault. It's a very personal crime.
Right.
And so you have to take into account the way that the brain reacts to that. And so you really have, so there's two models. So there's the one that's the 4 Fs that everybody kind of hears about: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so I like that model. I think it's great. One that I really like that kind of incorporates that is the difference between reflex responses and habit behaviors. And so those reflex responses are kind of your freeze, you have immobility, someone either kind of freezes in a way that your muscles can't move, maybe it's a collapsed state.
Right, kind of automatic, right?
Yes, absolutely. You don't get to choose that reflex reaction.
Right.
A lot of people dissociate, which is a very strong protective mechanism that your body has to just kind of be like, I'm not here, I'm not experiencing this. And then you have your habit behaviors, which kind of incorporate that fight, flight, fawn responses. And so those are really dictated by different circuits in your brain that get the most use. So if your whole life you've been told to make other people comfortable, to, not make a scene, things like that, you're so used to it. Your brain knows that that's a way to keep you safe in other situations. So in this situation, all your brain is looking for is, how can I get through this safely?
Right.
And so it's going to pick the quickest way it can do that. So one of those ways is to fawn, and that's to kind of placate the perpetrator and to do whatever you can to get out of the situation the fastest and the safest.
Right, and sometimes those behaviors come across to other people who may not be aware of trauma-informed responses as consensual, or as, going along with things willingly. But there's that element of emotional manipulation, of maybe previous abuse, and a fear for their life and for their safety that creates that response, right? And it's automatic, instinctive, for their own protection.
Yeah, and it's partly a thing where that does keep a lot of people safe.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same, it's funny because we give the same advice to people if they're being robbed, is to just give your stuff.
Yeah.
Give them the things that they're looking for, and then they will leave you alone and nothing worse will happen.
Right.
But then when it comes to sexual assault, suddenly it's a different story.
Right.
And so that's where we get this myth of, well, you didn't fight back. But no one says that if you're getting robbed, you should have fought back harder.
Right. You should have fought the person, holding you up or whatever it was. But we tend to maybe shift blame more on the victim and why they didn't do more, run, fight, whatever.
Yeah.
So hopefully we were able to educate the viewers a little bit on that response and minimize the amount of self-blame and shame that victims feel for not responding the way everyone assumes that they should during an assault or after. For the last myth that I have here is some people believe that survivors should be able to just get over it after a certain period of time, right? Family and friends might be supportive in the beginning, but then, they get burnt out towards the end or, they stop supporting. So what can you say about the reality of the belief that survivors should be able to just get over it with time?
I think the biggest thing is knowing, I promise you, if people could just get over it, they would.
Right.
People are not choosing to be in a place of pain and, experiencing the trauma every single day because they want to. It's not pleasant. People would love to live their lives the way that they would like to. And also going back to that experience of trauma as a physical response instead of just seeing it as an emotional response, because really trauma physically affects the brain. And they've done scans of people's brain after trauma that show that the brain shuts down physically. There's no function in parts of the brain. So looking at that, you can't will your brain to just do better at the drop of a hat.
Right.
So really it takes time, and going back to those circuits, you have to retrain your brain to think in certain ways and to give it a different way to function and to bring those parts back online. And part of that is restoring a sense of safety, and that's with others, with yourself.
Right.
And that takes a lot of time. And
definitely.
I think the most important thing is providing that support. And I think vicarious trauma is also important to talk about with this, and secondary trauma. I don't think that it's necessarily uncommon for people to be impacted by someone else's trauma and possibly react in that way because of that.
Okay.
But I think that discussion on boundaries and how they can best support that survivor while taking care of themselves is important.
Yeah, definitely. Having to help survivors learn how to maybe advocate for themselves in those scenarios and discuss their boundaries and know what their own boundaries are and what they feel safe and comfortable in doing. Well, Nicola, thank you so much for being here today and helping us debunk some of these really harmful myths about sexual violence.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us today and being a part of this important conversation. We're the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, and we're here to provide support, advocacy, and healing for survivors of sexual assault, violent crime, and traumatic circumstances. If you or someone you know needs support, please reach out to us. Our confidential helpline is available 24/7 at 407-500-HEAL. Remember, healing isn't always linear, and you are not alone.